Welcome everyone to the inaugural National Conservatives Australia podcast, which we're tentatively calling Bookish and Based. My name's Dan Ryan, and I'm joined today with, as I will be on all episodes, hopefully, by Jordan Knight. Look, we've put this together because the two of us have a bit of a meeting of minds that while there have been developments overseas in Europe, the United States and elsewhere, there really hasn't been much in the way of genuine conservative, national conservative discussion here in Australia. Most people don't get it. I was in the UK last year at that Alliance for Responsible Citizenship forum and had a quick chat with Miriam Cates. And she asked me directly, like, hey, Dan, what's going on with national conservatism in Australia? And the frank answer was not very much, Miriam, at all. And so I scratched around to try and work out who was saying sensible things. And Jordan and I are very much on the same page. And so this is simply to both to communicate to a national audience and for those that are interested internationally about what is going on in Australia with national conservatism. And because we hope that in due course, there will be a lot more than there currently is. And it's not as though there isn't a shortage of issues, right, Jordan? I mean, you've made a name for yourself in the area of immigration, and there is concern there.
Sorry, what was that?
There is concern. I mean, maybe it's worth just introducing what you've been doing in that area over the year and a bit.
Yeah. So I mean, similar to you, I sort of was looking around overseas at what was happening in America and the UK, and it all seemed pretty interesting and exciting. And all these new ideas that were coming out, that were sort of far more representative from the dull and boring sort of conservatism that was thriving in Australia and still is at the time. So I mean, I think like yourself as well, just started writing articles, basically ripping off these ideas and trying to put them into a Australian context and putting it into the Spectator and on Twitter, really. And just I always thought it was funny as well as that nationalism and national conservatism is kind of in its own way going global. So it's still globalist in a way, because we're basically just doing what globalism does, which is just rip off overseas ideas. But anyway, I mean, one of the big things that I was always interested in was immigration, and that was purely for a selfish point of view, which was, why is my rent going up? Why is the street getting busier? Why is my wage not as good as my father's wage was when he was my age, sort of thing? So I just asked all these questions, and it inevitably just drew me towards these ideas. So here we are. And
immigration is so central to it all. I mean, if you're going to list the three big ones and three big issues which distinguish national conservatism from sort of the more traditional normie centre-right baby boomer conservatism are trade, immigration, and foreign policy. And then there's other broader discussions about post-liberalism and the like. But immigration is probably one that's most easily to communicate to the general public. There has been huge concern in Australia in the last, what would you say, like particularly the last almost 3 to 6 months. It's really gotten into the mainstream media.
Really wrapped up.
Talking about it in a way they were too frightened to talk about it in the past, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when I run, as you know, Dan, and others may, I started like a social media, what is it? Essentially a social media campaign called Migration Watch Australia, just over a year ago. And basically all it was to do was to just raise awareness about immigration, because a year ago, 12 months, 14 months, even, like you say, as recently as like 6 months ago, nobody was talking about immigration at all, There was no discussion whatsoever. And so, in the last, 6 months, there's been like the occasional, spattering of maybe it's a little bit too high. And obviously good people who have sort of always been banging the drum were banging the drum, but the mainstream media was completely dead quiet.
And for anyone's international watching into this, the numbers have been dramatic, right? I mean, since COVID, when the borders were shut, since that time, they've decided to, ramp it up in a way they was never forecast, never predicted, and certainly never promised. And the numbers went from, I remember the last election, this last federal elections, the national election in Australia. I think ScoMo was promising, was it 180,000 or thereabouts? And Albanese said, "Oh no, he didn't expect it to go that high." And then after he got elected, it's gone up in the last it's the last 2 years, last 18 months. Is it about 800,000, right?
In gross terms, yeah, nearly 800,000. Around over 500,000 in net terms, which is astronomical. So we grew our population in 12 months by about 2.5%. So it's in my opinion, the biggest issue in Australia, and it is getting talked about a lot more, but it's just not getting talked about as sufficiently as I would like it to be spoken about.
And my fear is that it's been so dramatic that people can't ignore it, and they can't deny it's a legitimate subject matter, and they can't write it off as like something only kind of racist or God knows what are concerned about. But my concern is it will kind of come down a bit over the next couple of, because you can't sustain those. Are there that many people? I mean, there probably are coming to Australia, but then people will say, "Oh, we've now returned to normal." And my point and your point, right, is that we just need to reassess this whole thing from scratch, on a first principles basis. I mean, do we need any more Australia, which is getting up towards 330 million people? Do we need to be an immigration dependent, reliant kind of country at all? I mean, can't we sort of produce our own and develop naturally and organically? And so there needs to be like a dramatic sort of change in mindset, so that because at the moment we've just got all this immigration dependent growth and very hard to work out whether there's actually any real economic growth in Australia outside of stuff which is being developed, pushed through immigration, right?
Oh, that's right. We need a based reset, right? We need to sort of completely re-gear the economy and sort of society away from the sclerotic model of just like artificial growth through GDP and through people, into something. I mean, that's what's interesting about sort of NatCon, right? Is that it isn't that the question isn't answered yet, right? We still are finding our way on what the best policies are moving forward. Which is hopefully what we will be doing, over the podcast, next podcast as well. But that's what's interesting. Is like, okay, what is the future that we want for Australia? If it's not going to be a high immigration future, what kind of, what is the best amount? Do we even need to, do we need the current model that we need at the moment and have had? So that's what's interesting to me. Like, what is the future that we want? And that's something that conservatives have never really answered. They've always looked back and said, I liked what it was back then. It was really good in the 80s. It was good in the 1700s, whatever, who knows, right? Like, but yeah, nobody really has looked forward and said, or at least nobody on the right really has sort of looked forward and said, what is the future that we want for Australia? And that's what I'm interested in.
One of the things I like about, I mean, your Twitter handle and posts and the like, and which I think is also common with some of the champions of NatCon globally, and thinking of people like Nigel Farage and Trump to a certain extent and others, is that it's not grumpy. It's kind of like there's some hard criticism of immigration and other things, but it's done with style. And I was just joking before we got online that Suella Braverman, who is fairly has a reputation at least for being fairly tough. She's the former Minister of the Home Office in the UK, and seems champion of the sensible Tory right, which is a very small grouping really in my view. But she had a Twitter post, her first TikTok post, right, and it was just cringeworthy, and I'm just trying to work out why it is that like you have these guys who have both the style and the substance, why they go together, because that is most effective. Like if you've got a grumpy smile, if you've got a like a sour face, you're not going to convince anyone. It just seems to be something which is new.
That's really true. I was thinking about that just recently as well, especially just watching Nigel Farage. I'm sure you've seen like his videos and just his style and his brand. He's doing brilliantly, and he's just got this particular swagger that a mainstream conservative, politician never could. And I mean, I don't know why it is. I think possibly it's something to do with just being an outsider. If you're an insider and you get ahead as an insider, you naturally just become a sort of boring, behind closed doors operator. Whereas if you're a true populist, you're always sort of having that interaction with the people. So you've got that character that you're building. So Suella Braverman, sorry, what were you going to say?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, to me, it's like so many politicians, they're like, when they get on social media, it's like putting out a corporate press release, and it's standard form and they all learn the same way to put it out, and BHP announces new mine, right? It's that type of thing, and it has no character. It has no sort of swagger verve, because it's too risky to do that from a corporate side of things. It's been passed through the lawyers in a million different hands, right? Whereas these guys, sometimes they're independently wealthy, maybe they can, or just they're courageous to say bold things. So they're also courageous to say, courageous to take a bit of risk on what they put online. And some of it, sometimes it does miss, but it is probably a bit cringe themselves. But there's enough of it out there that they have more hits than misses in the end, right?
Yeah, that's true. And like you're right as well. It comes down to the bravery of it. It's like having the courage to just sort of go out there and not show what the consultants built of you and the consultant brained image, but like the actual image. I got to feel. I was reading it was basically a Guardian hit piece about Nigel Farage today, but it was an interesting sort of bio on him. And he honestly just kind of sounds like the bloke that he goes out and is on stage, right? Like I'm sure he sort of fluffs it up a bit, but at its core, I'm sure Nige that we see is basically the Nige that we get. Whereas, Suella Braverman's TikTok or, David Cameron, trying to shake hands with the bloke at the pub, completely different people.
Yeah.
I just don't think they're that higher caliber of people at the end of the day. These people, right?
That's probably it.
I always think about how Rupert Murdoch was the kind of guy that, he very obviously got and understood the average working class person, and the average bloke could shake hands with them and interact with them despite being a billionaire, right? But then he could go and meet Ronald Reagan and just shake hands with him and not be shy as well. He was a high caliber person that could, and I think Nige is probably of the same ilk, and it's only a small few people in the world who truly can. But yeah, again, it comes down to possibly what John McGowan, another Twitter, mostly calls, the competency crisis. There's a big competency crisis in politics at the moment. I do think it comes down to that partially. But,
Well, so many in the political class, and this is probably broadly speaking, but they mix with the great and the good. Some of them are independently wealthy, but not many of them are really. Many of them are sort of dependent on their next lobbyist job, and the rest of it. So they're not willing to offend, and they're not willing to take risks. And I always think that like the best democracies were ones where you had like the Roman sort of citizen soldier or the Greek, type who could they go in, they make their vote, and they go back to their fields, and they can give it or take it. Whereas these guys, you've got like small politicians living in apartments in Sydney. They know their wage can never afford a house, so they're only hoping that once they butter up enough people that they can eventually, I don't know, hit pay dirt by some later lobbying job later in life. So it's just a different mentality in total. Hey, why do you think like it is the sort of dog that didn't bark in the night? Why hasn't there been the same type of convulsions to date in Australia that we've seen in the Europe and the United States and elsewhere? I mean, there's dramatic. I was reading a Telegraph piece just literally before I got on it, and it's talking about like France undergoing, civil war, and I mean, that's not us yet, right? And there isn't really the political part. I mean, you've got One Nation ties and the rest of it, which is probably as close as we've come to a type of nationalist party, but it's a long way in terms of strength and structure and from what we've seen overseas. I mean, what explains it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it could just be as simple as the conditions aren't as bad here, like as context and as everybody knows, and it's surely across by now. But yeah, in Europe, they just went through the EU elections, and there was just a national populist sort of wave, basically, in France with Le Pen's party, and in Germany with AfD, and a few other countries. A few other countries apparently, like Sweden, actually the national populist vote sort of maintained or went down, but maybe that's expected. But nevertheless, I think broadly the trend is towards a sort of national right kind of EU continent. Why didn't it? Why hasn't that happened here? I think, look, Australia's kind of coming off at like what is probably at least 30 years of a bull market, where either through mining or population alone, we've just grown our economy, and things have at least seemed good. And we haven't had like the migrant surges that the asylum seeker refugee surges like Europe has. So there hasn't been that initial shock of this massive demographic change. Nevertheless, though, I mean, it's hard to sort of place, because Australia has gone through massive demographic change. Like we're talking about, like we have had a lot of immigration. It's just been through different channels, so legal immigration. But Claire Lemon a few months ago, I can't remember when, wrote a great article that sort of said, look, we can maintain the status quo on immigration when things are good. When the economy is good, everybody's still making money. They're all a bit distracted and working hard, so they don't really care. They're not. There's no pitchforks in the streets, right? The moment that changes and the economy explodes, which I kind of get the feeling that it may soon, then different story. People will sort of start to politicize and things like that. So I think we're probably not far from what's happening in Europe. I think we're going to inevitably be there. But what do you think?
The composition has been different of the type of we've had large numbers of legal immigration, but we have successfully cracked down on illegal boat crossings in a way that Europe hasn't been able to do. But in some ways, that's like a blessing and a curse, because there's been a perception. Certainly, there was an argument was made during the Howard era that because we've cracked down on illegal immigration, trained people can accept large numbers of migrants. But I don't think that was ever poll tested. And I read a recent certainly if that was the case then, which I never actually saw a poll on. There was a Lowry one, which I'm dubious about, but there certainly wouldn't be the case now. Matt Goodwin, who I'm sure you know is a political scientist in the UK, says some sensible things on that conservative front. He did his own polling recently and said UK citizens, at least the sample that he took, would prefer illegal migrants, the numbers, to the current legal numbers of immigrants. And that kind of makes sense, because the numbers coming across illegally, while dramatic, are a lot smaller than the legal migrants. And I think the difference too in Australia is that compared to Europe, it's the composition that has, which it's different having, Chinese don't form welfare ghettos, put it that way, they're not involved in the horrible gang things in Midlands of Europe and the rest of it, right? And we haven't also seen, at least at a political level, the type of demographic change yet. Like there's those photos which show that the Prime Minister of Ireland is Indian, the Prime Minister of UK is Indian, and all the mayors, a stack of mayors. I mean, the mayors in Australia, Adrian Schrinner here in Brisbane, there's whoever the mayor is. Who's mayor is it now? Clover still, is it?
Clover Moore, yeah.
Clover Moore. I mean, so you get these, that's a different type. We don't have Sadiq Khan type mayors yet in Australia, right? And you don't have in France, La Zone, just outside of Paris, with the banlieue, with all these, very restless, typically North African types who are a different character, let's put it that way, to the Chinese, Malaysian type of immigrants that we've accepted, and have done pretty well, assimilating in the numbers we had today. But because Australia's a pretty attractive place and it has a pretty assimilative sort of power, but the magic has its limits.
That's right,
and if you have so many numbers, the large numbers that we've seen, then you can't, you risk stretching it to breaking point at least. And so, yeah, so why hasn't that happened? It's a consequence of like times being pretty good. We've been deindustrialized, but our deindustrialization has been less than, say, the Rust Belts of the United States and the Rust Belts of Europe. And we've profited from the mining boom, which, Europe and others haven't. We've also been dispersed a bit, and the types of migrant we've had have been quite different, and has been highly skilled, I suppose. I mean, it's all out of date now, but in the, I think, Boris Johnson election, he was talking about introducing an Australian-style point system, as though that was the sort of the be-all and end-all. But we've well beyond that now, and then that point system is, not really, needs to be relooked at again here, because it's not.
Yeah, that's right.
Fit for purpose, right? So that's part of the reason. But and also we haven't had the political structures, right? We haven't had the charismatic kind of personalities that have latched onto Brexit type issues and sort of built out a framework around that.
Well, I mean, I think things like Trump and Brexit, they sort of came out of like a political tension that was there and that was being answered. And there hasn't really been that tension in Australia yet, but I do kind of feel like it is building, and I'm sure it's the same. I'm having conversations basically every day now with normal professional people who are sort of saying, "Okay, this isn't helping us anymore. Like, what's going on? What are we going to do about this? How are we going to fix it?" I feel like there is sort of something starting to bubble, and now everybody's looking over to Europe. Suddenly all these, think pieces and columnists are sort of coming out, sort of saying, oh yeah, that could also happen here. Like what we're seeing over there is exactly the same conditions that are starting to emerge.
Yeah.
And in terms of, you mentioned talent as well, like we don't have Naja Farad. I mean, Pauline, God bless her, she's got the right ideas on some things, but she's not a Naja Faraj or she's not a Donald Trump, and nobody, as far as I can tell, really is. And there also isn't that sort of, England has a really sort of intelligent national populist framework and of people that are there. They've got Matt Goodwin, they've got like the New Culture Forum, they've got like a media arm, they've got think tanks, they've got people there, like they've got this infrastructure that's starting to build. And next to that is the sort of political capital and the talent. But I mean, I guess that's what we're trying to do, right? But
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Oh, look, there's no. I always think we always get a bit overawed by the Brits, because yes, they have some very eloquent, sort of public intellectuals or whatever you want to call them, who come out here and do tours in Adelaide and Brisbane and all the rest of it. But and we don't really. I think there's something structural there, because we don't have the same guys who head across to Leeds and Manchester and give public lectures about the state of the world to a British audience, right? I mean, why should that be the case? We are, we're a wealthier country than the Brits. We have intelligent, journalists, and not as concentrated. London's very concentrated in the one joint, and got some old money there, but their think tanks, their Institute for Economic Affairs, like the IPA and CIS and stuff, they kind of, they're looking a bit tired in some ways, at least the traditional ones. And there's been some new ones, like you mentioned, that have come on board, and even people like Heard says things. But like that Alliance for Responsible Citizenship thing that I attended last year in London, they had the whole lecture. It was all very nice, and there were some lovely people there saying some very interesting things. They spent 3 whole days, and immigration was not mentioned once. And it's literally become the biggest issue in the whole of Europe. It may bring down the Conservative Party. And I just remember listening to a lecture, and it was literally in London, and literally down the road, there was major protests going on at the same time. People chanting like "Death to Israel, death to."
Wow. Yeah.
We're talking about carbon, nuclear power, and all very worthy issues in their way, but the biggest issue, right?
That's a common theme as well that I'm noticing, is that I go to these conservative events, and on the stage they're talking about these things like nuclear energy, and that's fine, and that's good. Family values and classical liberalism.
Yeah.
But in the audiences are these like young guys who are like, right, how are we cutting immigration? Like, what are we going to sort of how are we going to start this new party and take over the country? Like there's this disconnect between the sort of younger, angrier, and active people in the crowd versus the sort of the greybeards up on the stage.
Oh, it's amazing. It's almost hard to. I find it somehow they consume different media. The old they it's like you're reading from a completely different paper. It's very hard, and they're all well-meaning, and they probably can be won over in due course. But it's hard because when you talk things about particular points that you've seen on Twitter or TikTok or God knows what, or new media, they think you're, I don't know, talking crazy, or pulling it out of the ether. And Paul Kelly, let's name names. I mean, he is sort of the doyen of the Australian press kind of corps, the voice of.
It was exactly who I had in mind, by the way.
Sensible senator. Yeah, well, let's not hold past. And that guy, like his whole reputation, and he's a reasonable, nice fellow in person, right? But his whole reputation, it was built during the whole 80s and getting rid of the old settlement and the Hawke March, the Patriots, and all that sort of stuff. And what we're like, what the NatCons are sort of about is that, well, hang on, let's just reassess this, because everyone in Australia, and it's the case globally as well, in Europe and the United States, pretty much anyone pre-80s was a NatCon. We were like a NatCon revival band. It's like, they sort of believe there were differences between Labor and Liberal, but they sort of believe the same thing on trade, immigration, and even foreign policy to a certain extent. And there were lots of good developments that came out of the 80s, but people just pushed it to extreme and haven't readjusted. Like it's like, singing from the same songbook, and the world's changed, and they need to kind of think about it and do things differently. But what else was I going to say? So anyway, it's interesting. We had trade, immigration is one big issue. The other one I'd like to talk about is trade, and then the most controversial is foreign policy. But we had obviously.
Sorry, before we do, can I ask you just about what we were talking about before? I mean, we talked about England a lot. What about Australia? Do you think that there are good people and politicians at the moment that are basically NatCons? So, for example, a couple that come to mind. Alex Antic is, from what I can see, a pretty good guy. He doesn't talk about immigration.
He described himself as a NatCon to me once. So
he's
the only politician in Australia that I've heard that self-describe themselves as that. I think, Matt Canavan is probably. He's a thoughtful guy and a courageous guy, and sort of definitely understands the points.
Jared Rennick as well.
Yeah, he's a mate of mine, but he's an interesting guy. He's a bit, but he's basically right. Like he says some things I disagree with, but I think our democracy would be safe for having a whole lot of Jared Rennicks rather than a whole lot of rubber stamp politicians in Parliament too. And he basically gets it as well. And I just think it's sort of like you need to have a coherent intellectual structure so that people just don't think someone's shooting from the hip or spouting animus, so that they understand they're part of a coherent whole. So who else? I mean, look, there are people. Some of the commentators I kind of get a hint of like Rowan Dean. I think is kind of more or less would be up for it. But they tend to, they tend to get distracted fighting little kind of, fighting a culture war clips. I mean, not that culture it should be allergic or fighting that, but it's people looking stupid or people saying dumb things or people being too woke and all that stuff is useful. It needs to be fought, but immigration kills everything. Like, I mean, you can change the whole. Getting back to the Paul Kelly thing, I think these guys still think they're Hawke Keating debating in Parliament, and the broad populace hasn't changed very much, and they don't realize it's not so you can't step into the same stream twice. It's that the whole river has changed. You're not talking to the same audience. They have the same fellow feeling for the country in many cases that those guys did. So,
somebody was saying that it's somebody said that, when you get older, you kind of you dress the same in the same clothes as the age that you kind of peaked, right? So I mean, if you peaked in like your 20s, then you're just going to dress like you're in your 20s, and that was like you dress like it was the 80s forever or something like that, right? Kind of feels like
the same thing about rock music or music. You basically, the bands that you thought were great when you were 25 will be what you consider the peak of music.
Exactly, yeah. And so it kind of feels like, these guys had their bull market and they peaked with the Howard, and so they just took that on forever, and they took that around.
Absolutely. It's always 1989 in their mind. It sort of is. I was just going to say, I mean, just because every other, it is 17th of June, and Australia's had a visit from Li Qiang, who's the premier, second in charge in China. It's the first time I think someone's Albanese visited China last year or the year before. Anyway, Li Qiang has visited Australia, first visit from a Chinese leader, and I think since 2017, if I'm right. And the kind of attitude in the press is, it's either like, yes, it's important. We can't be too tough, and we can't be too weak, and we can't kowtow, and all the rest of it. But there's almost bipartisan uniformity of, yes, let's just get the trade back to normal, where we sell primary produce and they sell us manufactured goods, and that's stabilization, and that's what we need. And then we can talk about human rights and everything else in the background. And the weird thing is, like, there was a time, earlier on where I would have been the free market-y kind of guy, and yes, trade and that will bring peace and the rest of it all. But it does matter whether you are no longer an industrial country or not. If you can't produce stuff, you can't have a situation where, the traditional kind of colonial economy was one where they produced primary goods for the mother country. And we decided in Australia, since Federation, even before Federation, that we wanted to produce stuff, and we had tariffs on UK goods coming to Australia. But now, today, we have pretty much, 100%, close to 100% duty-free manufactured goods from China coming to Australia. There is no way, like, despite all this talk about we need to build stuff here in Australia again and throw stacks of money into doing it, you will not have a substantial manufacturing industry in Australia ever again, as long as you have 100% manufacturing goods from China coming in duty-free. It's just impossible. It's just that you may wish it otherwise, but it simply will not happen. And these guys, there is bipartisan, in the same way with immigration. Yeah, they might cut it here, cut there. They're never going to, decide on a pause for a couple, 10 years. They will not. There will never be, at least until there's. Well, we can make all the arguments, right? But there needs to be tariffs on goods. The interesting thing is, Scott Morrison recently, when he was in Washington, actually did say, "Oh, yes, it's sensible now for the United States to put tariffs on goods." I mean, what next? Is he going to turn around and say he's like, the whole shoulder bumping, elbow bumping thing was goofy and stupid, right? And Tony Abbott has said also that he wouldn't have signed the same trade agreement today. So I mean, that's interesting. You've got two people basically saying they're not happy with the agreement, and yet beyond that, John Howard still thinks it's 1990, and we can't resort to the old protectionism. Labor, despite throwing a lot of money, they're not changing the trade arrangements. So everyone's happy. We've back to stabilization in trade, but you're not going to build anything here in Australia. We're just going to be selling units and raw materials and agricultural stuff abroad. So I don't think that's a satisfactory. That's not what economic sovereignty. I don't think that's what people want ultimately. They just don't know how to get there, and it doesn't make sense in national security terms either, right? It's no point like protecting China from having some critical minerals, even though we send them all there to be processed anyway. You can't protect quantum computing here. I mean, it's no point where we can't build a tank or a car or a bicycle or even produce nuts and bolts. I mean, what are you going to do? The whole thing, it sort of misses the point in a way, or the whole China game. And I do think
Sorry, can I throw you a ball and ask, like, what would you sort of do, let's say, with China, for example? I mean, would you tariff some goods in the, like, let's say we have a price reset?
I would gradually, you got to do these things gradually, but not dramatic, but I would ramp up the tariffs across the board to at least 30%, if not higher. I mean, the US, Biden has kept 30%. We're the odd man out. I mean, the US has sort of 30% more or less across the board tariffs now on Chinese goods. It's upping them on 100%. This is Biden on electric vehicles. Trump says he's going to increase it to 200% on electric vehicles. But meanwhile, Australia is the largest. Get this, Australia is the largest. China sells more electric vehicles in Australia than it does in the whole of the United States. Like, it's crazy. European Union is not. They've introduced tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So we're the kind of odd man out. Again, globally, we're sort of we're not. This isn't us going out on a limb. Well, this isn't sort of Dan Ryan spouting kind of crazy ideas. This is sort of actually moving us more in line with Western
the rest
peers.
Of the world. Yeah.
So that's what, and China's the easiest one, I think, to sort of, which would actually just mean, changing the Australia-China trade agreement, and, to something which allows us to redevelop our own manufacturing industry. It's not, trade is it doesn't quite have the populist cut through that immigration does, but I think politicians wouldn't be talking about making things in Australia again if people didn't kind of look around and think, where are our factories? What are we actually producing here apart from selling, real estate and importing all this, wind turbines and solar panels and everything else from China to put on our roofs? It's not really I think people can sense at a sort of more primal level that it's not really, it's just to use an overused word, sustainable kind of an economy in a deeper sense.
I'm all for sustainability in terms of the economy, but I think what was interesting about the sort of tariff and trade argument over in America, at least, is that it's sort of Trump gave it a sort of visual or audible element, and he could encapsulate if he says that America is in decline or we're getting a bad deal on trade, the worst deal in history. It kind of sums up this grand sort of years of bad policy in one line, right? Whereas nobody's really made that argument here. So we sort of need somebody first of all to make that argument for tariffs and trade reform, I think, and also I think when we do start making the argument, people will start sort of encapsulating it, like sort of where I grew up in the sort of suburbs of Brisbane used to be a bit of a manufacturing hub, and it was a healthy sort of society in town. But then that sort of disappeared, and now it's just this like social and urban and cultural decay basically. And you kind of have to ask, like, eventually you do get to a point. It's like, okay, why is it like this if it wasn't always like this? And it's like you think back enough, and it's like, okay, we used to have jobs in manufacturing jobs. Why did we used to have manufacturing jobs and we don't anymore? Oh, okay, trade. So people start sort of drawing that connection when people make the argument. I think we are 10 years behind, and you're right. It isn't like migration, which is extremely pressing, and we can see it changing the country around us. But I think when we do have the politicians and the media infrastructure sort of making that argument, people will sort of see, oh yeah, why is everything free trade?
It's one of those ones, I think, unlike income tax rates where it's like, okay, this will affect my salary this much. With immigration and with trade, it's just a gradual changing. You don't sort of see, like, you don't know how many people are coming through the airport or the big shipment of goods coming in from China on a daily basis, where previously it used to be manufactured. It changes the society in a slow but dramatic way, but it's sort of almost an intangible way. You don't actually see it happening, at least initially. But yeah, man. Hey, we might wrap it up. I think it's a pretty good start, and in due course we'll get different people who come out of the woodwork who do exist in Australia. There's sort of a dormant army of NatCom people, I think, who are just looking for a bit of a locus to grab onto, really. And we saw them
podcast in the street and we picked it up with our sword, right?
And we've certainly connected, just for anyone else who's watching, we've connected now with, you know, the NatCon guys globally. You probably maybe will head across to the NatCon in DC. Yeah. So that's going
definitely. I'll be in America and I'll definitely try. So
yeah.
Really good. Yeah.
Yeah, and we've connected with the NatCon guys in Europe and elsewhere, and there's no one else doing that at the moment. So and we may get well, at some stage we'll get Hiram Hazoni, who's one of the leaders of it internationally. But you know, Australia will have its own little unique character to this, as we always do, for good, bad, or otherwise. And and it makes for interesting times ahead. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, on a sort of ending note as well. I mean, we complain like old ladies that, you know, there isn't anything going on in Australia. You know, there's nothing happening here. But I guess my message to every person I speak to, or you know, my message to myself as well, is that like this is actually an opportunity. I mean, the fact that there's nothing out there is the crown and the gutter waiting for you to pick it up. So yeah, we'll see. You're right. Exciting times ahead.
Good stuff. We'll leave it there. Until next time.